Daniel had no map. He had no horse. He had only a worn leather bag on his shoulder and a dirt road under his feet. He had been walking for 3 days when the trees changed. They grew taller here. The bark was darker. The air smelled different too, heavier and older, like something large had been breathing in these woods for a very long time. Daniel knew what that meant. He had crossed into Dragon Empire land. Most people turned back at the border. Most people never even got close. There were stories about what happened to humans who wandered too far into dragon territory. None of those stories ended well. But Daniel kept walking. He always kept walking. He was not a soldier. He was not a trader. He carried no weapons and no gold. What he carried was medicine. Wrapped cloth, dried herbs, small glass bottles, a bone needle and thread, a sharp knife for cutting away bad flesh, and a book of notes he had written himself over many years of practice. That was everything he owned. That was everything he needed. He had learned his craft from an old woman in a small village far to the south. She had taught him that pain was the same in every living thing. It did not matter if the patient had fur or scales or feathers. It did not matter if they were big or small. What mattered was finding the problem and fixing it as best as you could. Daniel had taken that lesson seriously. More seriously than anything else in his life. He heard the sound before he saw anything. A low, heavy breathing that was not the wind. Then a grunt of pain. Then silence. Daniel stopped walking and listened. He turned off the road and moved through the trees toward the sound. What he found was a young dragon lying on its side in a small clearing. The dragon was not much bigger than a large horse. Its scales were dark green and its wings were folded awkwardly beneath it. There was a deep gash running along its left foreleg, and the ground beneath it was dark and wet. The dragon's eyes were half open. Its breathing was slow and uneven. It had lost a lot of blood. Daniel did not run. He did not freeze. He walked forward slowly, keeping his hands where the dragon could see them, and he spoke in a low and steady voice. He told the dragon he was not there to cause harm. He told it he was a healer. He told it he had seen worse wounds than this and he was going to help. The dragon watched him with tired eyes but did not move. It did not have the strength to move. Daniel knelt beside the wound and opened his bag. He worked quickly and carefully. He cleaned the gash with water from his flask. He packed it with herb cloth to slow the bleeding. He used his needle and thread to close the worst parts of the cut. He worked without hesitation. His hands were calm. His breathing was steady. He had done this many times before. He did not notice the others arriving. He was tying the last of the bandage when the shadow fell over him. He looked up slowly. 3 dragon soldiers stood at the edge of the clearing. They were much larger than the young one on the ground. Their scales were darker and harder. They wore armor across their chests and they were all looking at him with expressions he could not fully read but understood well enough. Daniel stayed where he was. He did not stand up fast. He did not reach into his bag. He just held his hands open and waited. The largest soldier stepped forward and looked down at the young dragon on the ground. Something moved across its face. Then it looked at Daniel. Then back at the young dragon. The young dragon's chest was rising and falling slowly but steadily. The bleeding had stopped. The color in its face looked better than it had any right to look. The soldier said something in the dragon language. Daniel did not understand the words but he understood the tone. He was being told to get up and come with them. He packed his bag slowly. He stood up. He went with them. They marched him for 2 hours through the forest and into the mountain where the dragon empress held her court. The palace was carved into the rock itself. The ceilings were high and the halls were wide and everything smelled of old stone and burning wood. Dragons moved through the corridors and every one of them stopped to stare at Daniel as he passed. He was brought into a great hall and made to stand in the center of it. Empress Valith sat at the far end of the hall on a throne of dark stone. She was large even for a dragon. Her scales were deep red with hints of black at the edges. Her eyes were gold and they were fixed on Daniel with an expression that was cold and sharp and very, very still. The soldier spoke to her. Long sentences in the dragon language. Daniel caught none of it but he watched the Empress's face as she listened. She looked at him the way someone looks at something they do not yet know how to name. When the soldier finished speaking there was a long silence. Valith looked at Daniel for a long moment. Then she spoke one short sentence and looked away. 2 guards moved forward and took Daniel by the arms. They led him to a small stone room with a heavy door and no window. The door shut behind him. The lock turned. Daniel sat down on the floor, set his bag beside him, and rested his back against the cold wall. He was not afraid. He had done what he came to do. Somewhere far behind him, in a clearing in the forest, a young dragon soldier was still breathing. That was enough for now. The first dragon fell sick 3 days after Daniel was locked away. It started quietly. A palace guard who could not finish his meal. A young servant who sat down in the middle of her work and could not stand back up. A soldier who went to sleep early and could not be woken properly in the morning. Small things. Easy to explain away. Easy to ignore. By the second day it was harder to ignore. 6 more dragons were sick. They had the same signs. Weak legs. Heavy eyes. A dry heat coming off their scales that was not normal. They ate nothing. They drank little. The palace dragon healers moved through the halls with serious faces, speaking to each other in low voices, mixing medicines and brewing herbs and doing everything they knew how to do. Nothing worked. By the 3rd day there were 12 sick dragons. 2 of them could not lift their heads from the ground. The healers worked longer hours and spoke less. The palace grew quieter. The dragons who were not sick yet moved carefully, watching each other, watching themselves, waiting to feel the first sign of something wrong. Empress Valeth said nothing publicly. She walked the palace halls in the mornings and evenings, checking on her people herself. Her face showed nothing. She was very good at showing nothing. But her gold eyes moved quickly across every room she entered, counting, measuring, thinking. Her healers came to her on the 4th morning and told her honestly that they did not know what the illness was. They had not seen it before. They were trying everything but they could not find what was causing it and they could not find what would stop it. Valeth listened without interrupting. When they finished she dismissed them with a small nod and stood alone at her window for a long time. She did not look toward the small stone room where the human was being held. But she thought about it. She thought about the young soldier in the clearing. She had gone to see him herself the morning after Daniel was brought in. The wound had been serious. She had seen wounds like that before. She knew what they usually led to. But the young soldier was sitting up, eating, complaining about the bandage being too tight. The palace healers had looked at the wound and gone very quiet in a way that told her they were impressed and did not want to say so. She pushed the thought away and went back to her work. On the 5th day General Aldrich collapsed. He went down in the middle of the training yard. One moment he was standing, watching the younger soldiers practice. The next moment he was on the ground. It took 4 soldiers to carry him inside because he was large even for a dragon general and because his body had gone completely limp. Aldrich had served Valeth for 20 years. He was not just her general. He was the dragon she trusted most in the world. He had stood beside her in 3 wars. He had never once shown weakness in all the years she had known him. Seeing him lying on the floor of his chamber, barely able to open his eyes, hit her somewhere deep and quiet that she did not often let anything reach. Her chief healer came to her within the hour and told her in a careful voice that Aldrich's condition was very serious. That the illness had moved faster in him than in the others. That they were doing everything they could. Valeth stood in the doorway of Aldrich's chamber for a long moment. Then she turned and walked back to her throne room and sat down and stared at the far wall. She did not make the decision. She told herself that clearly. She made no order. She said nothing to anyone. But sometime that evening a small and quiet palace servant named Wren, who had worked in the lower halls for many years and who nobody paid much attention to, walked down to the stone room where Daniel was being held. Wren did not ask anyone for permission. Wren did not speak to any guards. Wren simply took the spare key from the hook inside the supply room, walked to Daniel's door and turned the lock. Then Wren walked away without a word. Daniel sat up in the dark. He had been sleeping lightly, the way he always slept in unfamiliar places. He heard the lock. He waited. The door did not open from the outside. He stood up, picked up his bag and pushed the door open himself. The corridor was empty. Daniel stood still for a moment. He could have walked toward the outer halls. He could have looked for a way out of the palace. Any reasonable person might have done that. He had been locked in a stone room for 5 days for the crime of helping someone. Instead he listened. Down the hall, somewhere deeper in the palace, he could hear the sound he knew better than almost any other sound in the world. The slow and labored breathing of something very sick. The kind of breathing that had a direction to it. The kind that was getting worse. Daniel followed the sound. He found Aldrich's chamber without anyone guiding him. He pushed the door open and walked in. 2 dragon healers were inside. They spun around when they saw him, eyes wide, bodies stiffening. One of them moved as if to call for guards. Daniel held up one hand. He kept his voice low and steady. He told them he was not there to cause trouble. He told them he just wanted to look. He walked to Aldrich's side and knelt down. He opened his bag and began working. Nobody stopped him. Daniel did not stop after Aldrich. He stabilized the general as best he could in the first hour. He checked the heat coming off the scales, looked at the eyes, pressed carefully along the neck and chest to feel for swelling. He asked the dragon healers questions using simple words and hand gestures when the language did not cross over. They answered cautiously at first, watching him the way you watch something you do not trust but cannot look away from. He figured out enough. The illness was moving through the body in a pattern he had seen before, not in dragons but in people. A slow poison that was not a poison exactly. Something in the air or the water that the body was treating like an enemy and fighting so hard that the fight itself was causing the damage. The body burning itself out trying to protect itself. He knew what to do about that. He had learned it years ago from the old woman who taught him everything. She had called it a kindness treatment. You do not fight the illness directly. You calm the body down. You give it what it needs to stop panicking. You let it find its own way back. Daniel pulled 3 small bottles from his bag and mixed them carefully in a clay bowl he asked the healers to bring him. He added dried leaves from a folded cloth pouch and a small amount of clean water. He worked slowly so the healers could watch. He did not hide any step. He explained each thing he added in the simplest words he could find. He gave the mixture to Aldrich in small amounts. Then he sat back and watched. After a while he stood up and looked at the 2 healers still in the room. He pointed toward the door and raised his eyebrows in a question. Are there others? They looked at each other. Then one of them nodded and led him out. That was how the night began. Daniel moved through the palace from room to room, chamber to chamber, following the healers who walked with him now not as guards but as something closer to partners. They stopped being cautious somewhere around the 2nd hour. Maybe it was the way he worked. Maybe it was the way he never rushed and never panicked even when the patient in front of him was in a bad way. Maybe it was simply that they were tired and frightened and he was the only one in the building who seemed to know what he was doing. He visited 11 sick dragons that night. Some were only mildly ill and needed just a small amount of the mixture and some rest. He showed the healers how to prepare it themselves, making them repeat the steps back to him until he was satisfied they had it right. He told them clearly which amounts to use for larger bodies and which for smaller ones. He made them write it down. Some were worse. There was a young female soldier near the east wing whose breathing had become so shallow and quick that it sounded like she was running even though she was lying completely still. Daniel sat with her for a long time. He kept one hand resting lightly on her foreleg so she could feel that someone was there. He spoke to her in a low, quiet voice even though she could not understand his words. He had learned long ago that the voice mattered more than the words when someone was frightened and in pain. The tone was what reached them. The steadiness of it. Her breathing slowed after a while. Not all the way to normal. But slower. Better. He moved on. There was an older dragon in the lower halls who had been sick the longest and was in the worst shape. His name was Baron and he was one of the palace's oldest residents, a retired soldier who now worked in the records room. He was so still when Daniel entered that for one moment Daniel thought he was too late. He was not too late. He worked on Baron for almost an hour. It was the hardest case of the night. The body had been fighting for too long and was exhausted down to its core. Daniel used everything carefully, every small tool in his bag, every technique he knew. He talked through every step out loud, not for the healers this time but for himself. It helped him think. By the end of the hour Baron's color had shifted slightly. The dryness in his scales eased just a little. His breathing deepened. Daniel sat back on his heels and let out a slow breath. One of the dragon healers, a younger one who had been following Daniel all night and watching everything with wide serious eyes, said something quietly in the dragon language. Daniel did not understand the words but the tone was clear. It was something like relief. Something like gratitude. Daniel nodded and stood up. He did not stop until the sky outside the high palace windows began to change from black to the deep blue that comes just before morning. He had not eaten since the previous day. He had not sat down properly in hours. His knees ached and his back was stiff and his eyes were tired in the way that goes deeper than just needing sleep. But by the time the first light came through the windows, 3 of the most serious patients were breathing steadily. 2 others who had been worsening through the night had stabilized. The rest were holding on with the treatment the healers now knew how to give them. Daniel walked to the end of a quiet corridor and sat down against the wall with his bag in his lap. He did not know that Empress Valeth had been watching for the last 2 hours. She stood at the far end of the hall, still and silent in the early morning shadows, and she watched the human healer close his eyes and rest his head back against the stone wall. She stood there for a long time before she finally turned and walked away. Valeth did not summon Daniel immediately. She waited 2 days. She told herself it was because she was busy. There were reports to read and decisions to make and a palace still recovering from illness. All of that was true. But it was not the real reason she waited. The real reason was that she did not yet know what she wanted to say to him. That bothered her more than she wanted to admit. Valeth had ruled the Dragon Empire for 30 years. She had faced warlords and rebellions and enemies who were larger and older and more powerful than anything a human could imagine. She had always known what to say. She had always walked into every room already certain of her words. This was different. She had watched him work through the night. She had seen him kneel beside dragons who could have crushed him without effort, dragons who had locked him in a stone room, and treat them with the same steady, careful hands as if none of that mattered at all. She had watched him teach her own healers without making them feel small. She had watched him sit with the young frightened soldier in the East Wing and speak to her softly for a long time even though he knew she could not understand his words. Valeth had ruled through strength her whole life. Through power and fear and the understanding that the world respected those who could not be broken. She knew how to read people. She knew what motivated them. Gold, safety, revenge, ambition. Everyone wanted something. Everyone had a reason for what they did. She could not find Daniel's reason. And that unsettled her deeply. On the third morning she sent for him. Daniel was brought to a small private hall, not the great throne room where she had first seen him. This room was quieter. There were no crowds, no soldiers watching. Only Valeth and 2 guards standing far back near the doors. A chair had been placed in the center of the room. A small table beside it with water and food. Daniel walked in, looked at the chair and sat down. He was calm. He helped himself to the water without being told he could. He looked around the room with the open and unhurried expression of someone who had nothing to hide and nothing to prove. Valeth stood across from him. She had not planned to stand. She had planned to sit on the raised seat at the end of the room and look down at him the way she looked down at everyone who was brought before her. But when she had walked in and seen him sitting there so quietly, something about sitting above him had felt wrong in a way she could not explain. So she stood on the floor level. Across from him. Equal distance. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then she asked him directly. Why did you help them? Not a soft question. A hard one with weight behind it. She spoke his language well enough. She had made sure of that before sending for him. Daniel looked at her. He did not look nervous. He did not look like he was choosing his words carefully to protect himself. He just looked at her the way he might look at anyone who had asked him a genuine question. He said that he heard someone in pain and he knew how to help. So he helped. Valeth shook her head slightly. That was not enough of an answer and they both knew it. She pressed harder. She told him that her soldiers had dragged him through the forest and thrown him in a dark room for 5 days. She told him they had given him no food on the first day and no light at any point. She told him that any reasonable person would have walked out of that unlocked cell and run as far and as fast as they could. She asked him again. Why did you stay? Why did you help? Daniel was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone searching for a lie. The quiet of someone deciding how honest to be. Then he told her. He said that suffering does not choose a species. He said that a dragon in pain and a person in pain looked different on the outside but felt the same on the inside. He said he had sat beside enough dying things in his life to know that at the very end, when everything else falls away, all any creature wants is for someone to stay with them and try. He said he could not walk past that. He had never been able to walk past that. He did not think he ever would be. He said that the room they locked him in was cold and dark and yes, that was not kind. But the dragon in the clearing had been bleeding alone in the dirt. That was worse. That was the one he could not leave behind. Valeth said nothing. She had prepared responses in her head before coming into this room. Arguments. Follow-up questions. The kind of sharp and probing words she used to pull apart the reasoning of advisors and enemies and anyone who stood before her. She had been ready to find the crack in whatever he said. The selfish thing underneath. The hidden angle. There was no crack. She stood in front of this small and tired human with his worn leather bag in his careful hands and she had absolutely nothing left to say. It was the strangest feeling she had experienced in 30 years of ruling. Not weakness exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that felt almost like the first moment of understanding a language you had been hearing your whole life but never quite learned. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned and walked to the window and stood with her back to him and looked out at her empire spread below her. Daniel finished his water quietly and waited. He was good at waiting. Outside the window the morning was clear and the mountains were sharp against the sky and Valeth stood very still and thought about everything she thought she had known. Daniel was ready to leave by the following morning. Nobody had told him he could go. Nobody had told him he could not either. After the meeting with Valeth he had been taken back to a proper room this time, not the stone cell but a small guest chamber with a window and a real bed. He had slept for a long time. Longer than he usually allowed himself. His body had needed it badly. When he woke he checked on his bag. Everything was still there. He sorted through what he had used and made small notes in his book about the illness, what he had observed, what had worked, what he would do differently next time. He always wrote notes after a difficult case. It was how he learned. It was how he made sure the next patient had a better chance than the one before. He thought briefly about whether he should ask to see Aldrich before leaving, to check on his recovery. But he had spoken to one of the dragon healers the evening before using slow words and simple gestures and understood that Aldrich was sitting up and eating. That was enough. That was what he had come to do. He put on his coat, picked up his bag and walked out of the room. The palace halls were quieter than they had been during the worst nights of the illness, but they were not empty. Dragons moved through the corridors going about their work. Several of them stopped when they saw Daniel walking. They watched him pass. He nodded to the ones who met his eyes and kept moving. He found his way to the main passage that led toward the front of the palace. He had paid attention when they brought him in. He had always paid attention to exits. Old habit. The passage opened into a wide courtyard that led to the palace gate. The gate was large and heavy, made of dark iron and old stone, and it stood open in the morning. Beyond it Daniel could see the mountain road that would take him back down toward the forest and eventually back to the world he knew. He walked toward it steadily. He was about halfway across the courtyard when he heard it. A single voice behind him, speaking clearly and carrying across the open space without effort. Valeth said his name. Just his name. Daniel. Spoken in her low and careful voice that was used to filling large rooms. He stopped. He turned around slowly. What he saw was not what he expected. The courtyard was full. He had not noticed it when he walked in because he had been looking forward toward the gate. But now he saw that dragons lined both sides of the courtyard. Soldiers in armor. Palace servants. Healers. Officials in formal dress. Even some of the patients who had been sick and were now recovering, standing carefully with the help of others. They were all there. All of them watching. Valeth stood at the top of the steps that led from the palace entrance down into the courtyard. She was in full empress dress. Deep red and black, the colors of her scales. She stood straight and tall the way she always stood, the way that made the air around her feel heavier. Daniel stood in the middle of the courtyard with his worn bag over his shoulder and his coat that had seen better years and looked at her. For a long moment no one moved and no one spoke. The courtyard was completely silent except for the wind coming down off the mountains. Then Valeth descended the steps. Not quickly. Deliberately. One step at a time, the way someone moves when they want every person watching to understand that what is happening is a choice and not an accident. She crossed the courtyard and stopped in front of Daniel. She was much larger than him. Even standing on flat ground she towered over him in the way that all dragons towered over people. But she stopped at a respectful distance and she looked at him directly and her gold eyes were steady and clear. And then Empress Valeth, ruler of the Dragon Empire, who had not bowed her head to any living creature in 30 years of rule, lowered her head. Not a small movement. Not a slight tilt that could be explained away. A real bow. Slow and deliberate and visible to every dragon standing in that courtyard. She thanked him by name. She said Daniel clearly so that everyone present could hear it. She told him that he had come into her empire as a stranger and had been treated poorly and had answered that poorly treatment with nothing but skill and care and steadiness. She told him that her people were alive because of his hands. She told him she would not forget that and neither would her empire. She straightened up and looked at him again. Daniel stood quietly through all of it. When she finished he looked at her for a moment with the same open and calm expression he carried everywhere. Then he smiled. It was a small smile, tired around the edges but genuine all the way through. He nodded once. Then he turned and walked toward the gate. Nobody stopped him. The dragons lining the courtyard watched him go. Some of them lowered their heads slightly as he passed. Not all of them. But some. Enough. Daniel walked through the gate and onto the mountain road without looking back. Behind him the courtyard stayed silent for a long moment after he was gone. Valeth stood where she had stopped and looked at the open gate and the empty road beyond it. She thought about what he had said to her. That suffering does not choose a species and neither does he. She had ruled for 30 years through power and fear and the certainty that strength was the only language the world truly respected. She was no longer certain of that. She turned and walked back up the steps into her palace. There was work to do. There was always work to do. But something had shifted in the way she intended to do it. Something quiet. Something that would take a long time to fully understand. But it was there. And it had been left behind by a tired human with a worn leather bag who had asked for nothing and given everything.